Buckle up, everyone, because today's deep dive is going to be a wild one. We're taking a roller coaster ride through recent U.S. history. From the 1990s all the way to the Obama years. It's like trying to squeeze decades of change into a single hour. We're going deep into chapter 31 of a history textbook that's all about globalization. But honestly, this is about way more than just economics. Think partisan battles, a tech explosion that totally reshaped our lives, and the long shadow of 9/11. Are you ready to see how it all connects?
What's really interesting about this period is how much domestic and global events are all tangled up together. On the one hand, the world's becoming more and more interconnected, but at the same time, the U.S. is going through some of the most intense internal divisions we've seen in recent memory.
It's true. Like those government shutdowns back in the 90s, those weren't just headlines. They were like a symptom of something much bigger brewing under the surface.
Yeah.
You can't talk about this era without bringing up the P word, partisanship.
Exactly. And you think about the Monica Lewinsky scandal and Clinton's impeachment. Those events didn't just happen in a vacuum. They poured gasoline on that partisan fire. It's like both sides dug their trenches even deeper. And that set a pattern that we're still dealing with today.
It's crazy how much it still resonates. But in the middle of all this political drama, there's this other revolution happening. The internet. It's almost hard to imagine now. Those days of dial-up modems, waiting forever for a picture to load pixel by pixel. But that was the beginning of so much we just take for granted now. Personal computers in every house, smartphones in every pocket.
And eventually social media. It's this massive force. And honestly, it's easy to forget how fast our lives changed. I mean, we went from being excited about sending emails to basically having the entire world's information, and let's be honest, misinformation too, at our fingertips 24/7. It's kind of mind-blowing. And honestly, the internet's impact is still unfolding.
No doubt. It's a constant evolution. But it wasn't just the digital world exploding. This is also when the Human Genome Project really takes off. It pushed the boundaries of what we even knew about our own DNA. All of a sudden, things like genetic engineering and stem cell research, they weren't just science fiction concepts anymore. They were real ethical debates happening in real time.
Yeah, it was a period of just massive change on so many different fronts. And while all this technology was leaping forward, society itself was trying to deal with some pretty major transformations too. For example, the baby boomer generation. They started putting a real strain on Social Security and Medicare, and that's a challenge that's still front and center in political debates today.
Absolutely. It's one of those issues that just never seems to go away.
Yeah.
And you can't forget about immigration. It became super important as a source of labor during this time. But there was a noticeable shift happening too. We saw a move away from mainly European immigrants. To a much bigger influx of people from Asia and Latin America. It really reshaped the demographics of the country.
Right. And in the middle of all this, you have the fight for LGBTQ rights. It was gaining serious momentum. And it all led up to the 2015 Obergefell v. Hodges decision, which legalized same-sex marriage nationwide.
It's pretty amazing to see how much changed in just a few decades.
It really is. From the structures of society to the very makeup of our families. It was a time of massive upheaval. And speaking of upheaval, let's talk about the economic roller coaster of the early 21st century. I mean, one minute it's the dot-com bubble. Everyone's throwing money at anything with a dot-com at the end of it.
And then the next minute, it all comes crashing down. The 2008 financial crisis is a moment that's like burned into our collective memory. Risky mortgage practices, deregulation like the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act. It all came together to create this perfect storm.
Oh, yeah. Foreclosures everywhere, job losses through the roof. The government having to step in with these massive bailouts like TARP. It was the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. And those scars are definitely still visible today. No question, it left a mark. And then in response to the crisis, you have the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare as everyone calls it, taking center stage. The goal was to get more people access to health care, but it quickly became this major battleground in the ongoing partisan war.
It definitely became a lightning rod issue. Healthcare in the U.S. is always tied up in these huge debates about the government's role, individual responsibility, the whole 9 yards.
You said it. It touches on everything. But before we get too deep into the weeds of healthcare reform, there's another event we need to talk about, one that cast a really long shadow over everything that came after it. September 11th, 2001. It's a date that changed everything, not just for the U.S., but for the whole world.
It's hard to believe it's been over 2 decades. I can still remember exactly where I was when I heard the news. That feeling of just complete disbelief, the fear, the uncertainty that really felt like the world had completely shifted on its axis.
The 9/11 attacks were a major turning point for U.S. foreign policy. Suddenly, counterterrorism was the #1 priority, and it shaped everything, from military strategy to domestic surveillance.
And the 9/11 Commission report. That really exposed some of the big systemic failures that led to the tragedy. It turned out that intelligence agencies weren't sharing information effectively. It was a critical misstep that allowed the attacks to happen.
Yeah, that realization led to some pretty significant changes. But of course there were trade-offs. Like the Patriot Act, which was passed right after 9/11, it expanded the government's surveillance powers. And that raised serious concerns about privacy and civil liberties.
For sure, the Patriot Act was super controversial. It allowed for things like warrantless wiretapping and collecting people's internet browsing history. A lot of people saw that as a huge overreach of government power.
Absolutely. And then you have the Bush doctrine of preemptive strikes, this idea that the U.S. could act unilaterally, even without clear evidence of an immediate attack. It sparked a huge global debate about the limits of American power.
It felt like the whole world was watching, wondering what this new, more assertive American foreign policy was going to mean. And that uncertainty was made even worse by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Right. Operation Enduring Freedom, which was the initial response to 9/11, saw the U.S. launching airstrikes against al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and targeting Taliban military installations. The goal was to take down al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban from power.
But as we know, that mission turned out to be a lot more complicated and drawn out than anyone expected. Afghanistan became this quagmire, a war that seemed to have no end in sight.
It did, and the war in Iraq, which started in 2003, was even more controversial. The Bush administration claimed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, posing a direct threat to the U.S. But as we all know now, that intelligence was wrong.
It was a huge gamble, and it didn't pay off, the invasion of Iraq, based on bad information. Destabilized the whole region, it led to a surge in sectarian violence, and eventually the rise of ISIS.
Yeah, the unintended consequences of the Iraq War are a pretty sobering reminder about the complexities of foreign intervention. Removing Saddam Hussein created a power vacuum that extremist groups like ISIS were all too happy to fill.
It's a perfect example of how even actions with good intentions can have these devastating and completely unforeseen outcomes. And speaking of unintended consequences, the post-9/11 era saw this constant back and forth between security and freedom. It's like this fundamental question: how do you protect a nation from terrorism without sacrificing the very values that define it?
It's a question that we're still grappling with today. The Patriot Act, while it was meant to prevent future attacks, gave the government really broad surveillance powers, including the ability to monitor U.S. citizens suspected of having ties to terrorism.
And then there's Guantanamo Bay, where captured foreign fighters were held indefinitely, often without any charges or access to lawyers. Human rights groups condemned these practices. They argued that they were violations of international law.
And the Justice Department defended their actions. They argued that terrorists were unlawful combatants, not entitled to the same protections as prisoners of war. They even justified using enhanced interrogation techniques, like waterboarding, which many people consider to be torture.
It was a dark time in American history. The Abu Ghraib scandal, where photos came out of U.S. soldiers abusing Iraqi prisoners, that further damaged America's reputation in the world.
Those images from Abu Ghraib were really shocking. They were a reminder of the potential for abuse. When you combine unchecked power with wartime anxieties, it raised serious questions about military conduct and the need for accountability.
Absolutely. And back home, while the nation was dealing with the aftermath of 9/11 and the wars overseas, another issue was starting to gain attention: police brutality against African Americans, the Black Lives Matter movement, sparked by the deaths of unarmed black men at the hands of police, forced the country to confront the persistent legacy of racism in America.
The Black Lives Matter movement wasn't just about those individual incidents, though. It was about systemic injustice, about these deeply rooted inequalities that are woven into American society. It highlighted the urgent need for criminal justice reform, and it sparked a nationwide conversation about race and equality.
It was a pivotal moment. And all of this was happening against a backdrop of intense political division. The 2000 election between George W. Bush and Al Gore was one of the closest in U.S. history. It ultimately ended up being decided by the Supreme Court, and it was a clear sign of just how polarized the nation had become.
Absolutely. And then you have the historic election of Barack Obama in 2008, the first African-American president, a symbol of hope and progress for so many people. But his victory also triggered a backlash from people who felt threatened by the changing face of America.
Yeah, the rise of the Tea Party movement is a prime example of that backlash, fueled by anger and resentment, often mixed with racist and xenophobic undertones. The Tea Party mobilized grassroots opposition to the Obama administration.
They tapped into this deep well of anxiety about economic insecurity, cultural shifts, and the idea that traditional values were being eroded. They even questioned Obama's legitimacy, falsely claiming that he was born in Kenya. And they pushed for these restrictive policies, targeting voting rights, abortion access, and undocumented immigrants.
It was a very volatile time in American politics. While Obama represented progress and change for a lot of people, he also faced fierce opposition from those who wanted to preserve a more traditional, and some would argue exclusionary, vision of America.
Exactly. And on top of all of that political turmoil, Obama also had to deal with the lingering effects of the 2008 financial crisis. His administration put in place some pretty significant reforms, like the Dodd-Frank Act, to try and regulate the financial industry and prevent another meltdown.
The Dodd-Frank Act was a huge piece of legislation. It was all about trying to rein in the risky practices that led to the crisis. It created new agencies like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to protect people from predatory lending.
It was a big step. But even with those reforms, economic inequality kept growing. The gap between the rich and the poor got wider, and it fueled this feeling of frustration and resentment among people who felt like they were being left behind.
That feeling of being left behind, like the system was rigged against ordinary people. That's what gave rise to the Occupy Wall Street movement. It was a protest against corporate greed, the influence of the 1%, and the growing concentration of wealth at the very top.
Yeah, it felt like the Occupy movement really captured the mood of the country at that time. All that anger and disillusionment, the feeling that the American dream was slipping away for a lot of people.
It was a powerful movement, and even though the protests themselves eventually died down, the issues they raised, income inequality,
Yeah.
corporate power, the influence of money in politics, those issues are still with us. In fact, they've only become more important in the years since then.
It's true. They're still front and center in a lot of ways, and it's kind of crazy to think about this. But in the middle of all these challenges, all this division and turmoil, Obama won re-election in 2012. Looking back at how polarized things are now, it's almost hard to believe. I know. It's a good reminder that even when things are super divided, there's still this desire for unity, for hope. Obama's victory really showed his ability to connect with voters across the political spectrum, to offer a vision of a more inclusive and just America.
And yet, even with that victory, the partisan divide didn't disappear. It felt like the nation was just holding its breath, waiting for the next big political earthquake.
Yeah.
And as we know now, that earthquake was just around the corner. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration of history's hidden depths.